The Atlanta Story is a podcast highlighting Atlanta's most interesting creators, entrepreneurs, and builders. I'm JC Lucas with Atlanta Ventures and co-producer alongside Jon Birdsong. In this episode, Jon sits down with former mayor of Atlanta, Shirley Franklin. Mayor Franklin served as mayor from 2002 to 2010 and leaves an incredible legacy affecting every Atlantan today. In this episode, we talk about her reputation as a mayor who cleaned out our sewer system, had the political vision to act on the Beltline, and lessons she's learned from her time working with Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young. We also learned how she's transitioned from public to private life, including her current involvement with purpose-built communities, and much more. We hope you enjoy the show and subscribe to The Atlanta Story.
Mayor Shirley Franklin, thank you for joining us on the Atlanta Story podcast.
It's my pleasure. If you'll just drop the mayor, we'll be fine.
You got that. I'll give you that one, Shirley. I love it. Born and raised Philadelphia, Howard University, graduate work at University of Pennsylvania. Before we talk about what brought you to Atlanta, talk about Howard University. You know, obviously the Vice President Harris is a graduate. Describe the connection and the bond, because so many friends that went to Howard have this loyalty and allegiance that's like almost like Notre Dame, you know, where you know, to me it just, people who are Notre Dame, just Notre Dame fans for life. Can you share just what the Howard experience meant to you and what it still means today?
Jon, I grew up in a family. My mother and father were Howard University alums. So I heard a lot about Howard University, especially from my father. He went when he was a teenager and finished law school, having studied with Thurgood Marshall and knowing some other giants of the civil rights era. So there was never any question in his mind or my mother's mind that Howard University would be the school that I would attend. And in fact, it was the only school I applied to.
Wow.
In those days, you know, applying to school was not quite as open as it is today. I mean, we had to write to the university and get a catalog, review the catalog, then ask for an application. Yeah. So it was a several-month process. So by the time you're accepted, you're already kind of you're already in the game. Yep. You've already decided that this is a really special place. I never visited Howard before I went to college, but I got there and I met people from all over the country, mostly African American, but not only African American. And my professors included Sterling Brown, who was a Black Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance poet, who is very, very famous. I met other professors, Dr. Sowell, who continues to write, and I follow his writings, though I disagree with him most of the time. But it was the kind of place where there's a lot of dialogue and discussion about world affairs. And you were really clear in every single class. It didn't matter whether it was biology or sociology or physical education. You were really clear that you were expected to go out into the world and make a difference. And I am sure Kamala, Vice President Harris, and others that you are referencing had the same experience.
Yeah, Mayor Reed, also a Howard alum. And particularly with Vice President Harris, you know, you can just see the excitement around the alumni and which is cool.
But I would also add, I mean, there are traditions at Howard. I mean, the tradition was that we learned Black history. I was allowed as a junior at Howard to study African studies. And this would have been in 1966, 1967, before it was broadly offered to undergraduate students. So there was this willingness to have students kind of chart their own course, as well as to follow the main program. So it really instilled, and it reinforced whatever intellectual curiosity that you had.
Sure.
And of course, I was at Howard when Sekou Touré, also known as Stokely Carmichael, and Cleve Sellers, Bakari Sellers' father. They were founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Yep. So they were a year or two ahead of me. So I had a chance to go to the briefings that they were giving after they worked in the South during the summer.
Sure.
So not only did I get a rich education, I had a chance to connect with people who at a very young age, Cleve Sellers was 19 years old from South Carolina. And I got a chance to hear about how important he felt political action would be, not just to his life, but to my life long term.
And your intellectual curiosity took your graduate work to University of Pennsylvania and then to Atlanta. What pulled you to Atlanta?
Well, I had a short stop, almost 3 years in Alabama. I went to teach at a small historically black college, Talladega College, political science and sociology. George Wallace was the still in office. Small town, county of 15,000. So I went from a city of millions, big city experience in Philadelphia and Washington, to this really small town. And I fell in love with the South. I fell in love with how close people were in their lives, in their beliefs to the earth and to each other and to a sense of community. And I really wanted to be a part of kind of the transformation that was taking place in the United States that had been sparked before I went to Howard, but was certainly nurtured at Howard and nurtured by some of the really great people I had a chance to work with.
So you go from big city to small Alabama town, fall in love with it. What was that first month like? I mean, was it sticker shock and what'd you fall in love with?
I fell in love with the people.
Yeah.
I mean, they were farmers. They were direct. They understood that higher education was a key to success long term. The college had 600 students, a couple hundred faculty members. Everybody committed to uplifting the African American community, and a willingness to work with whites who were also interested in the transformation that was taking place. This is after the Voting Rights Act. So I went to Alabama in 1969-70 period.
Yep.
Now, I am a big city girl.
Yeah, 3 years. I mean, you could have been a lifelong teacher, right?
I could have been. I am a big city girl. So I ended up traveling to Atlanta a good bit.
Yep.
And that travel brought me in contact with people like Marvin Arrington, Andrew Young, David Franklin, who I ultimately married, and I was interested in Maynard Jackson.
Maynard Jackson, yep.
So I had a chance in that period to get to understand what was going on in Atlanta. And Atlanta was a bigger city by far. And I was attracted to that and the civil rights history.
And so that was 72?
72.
Okay. And so 72, fast forward to 2002, 30 years in all sorts of government roles, right? Worked under, as you mentioned, Maynard Jackson, Andy Young. What are some of the lessons you learned from their leadership that you applied to, you taking over the city in 2002?
Well, let's just start with Andy Young and Maynard Jackson were, Andy still is, but they are incredible leaders. So I couldn't even begin to imitate the success that they had in their careers. I mean, they were trailblazers, they were courageous, they were bold, they were creative thinkers, very innovative.
Charismatic.
Well, definitely charismatic. I mean, Maynard would walk into a room and dominate the room just by his sheer presence. Mm-hmm. Andy continues to dominate conversations by the wealth of his experience.
Storytelling. He's such a great storyteller.
And experiences.
Yeah.
So I don't pretend to have just even a thimble, a little bit of what they have. But I did learn some things from them. They loved what they did. And so public service, I believe, is you are best served when the people who are the public servants love what they do. Yeah. They don't do it for other reasons. They do it because that's what they want to do, not because it's a default career or they just happened to be in the right place at the right time. They absolutely loved what they did. And equally important is they loved the people they served. They loved getting to know people. They were great observers. Maynard made you feel as if you were the only person in the room. Andy always has a story related to whatever you're talking about. I mean, his ability to relate to you through storytelling and through his own experiences, many of them with iconic leaders, really is just captivating. So that's kind of the second thing.
Do you feel like that has been lost in the age of social media and digital media, kind of making it where you can kind of outsource some of the storytelling and, you know, put up a YouTube video and tweet it out, and that kind of one-on-one relationship building and grassroots building is not as important?
Oh, I think both Andy and Maynard would have been wonderful using technology and social media. Maynard would have known everything all the time. I mean, he would have been maybe addicted to it in some ways, you know, because he was that kind of person. But I don't think it has to be lost. I mean, people learn in different ways. Some people learn. One of the abilities that you have with social media is to actually see something. So you can use your imagination, but you can also be confronted with the images, or the words, or revisit it, which is really a plus.
I was looking at your Twitter account. You were active till about 15, and then kind of put it aside. Do you still get on Twitter, and will you look at the at least the latest updates on what's going on?
Well, my son died in 15. And he got sick. Thank you. He got sick in 15, and he and I discussed those Twitter posts, and he made me promise that I would not go crazy on Twitter.
That's a good promise.
he made me promise that I would not just pop off on Twitter. So I just kind of...
Very sage.
I have left that alone because he was a filter for what I posted on social media. I'm active on Instagram, and not so much on Facebook anymore. But much of what I post on Instagram is really just personal, and I post a lot about the outdoors because I think we forget about that. I mean, we're in these enclosed spaces, and we forget how beautiful the outdoors is.
And you know, during the pandemic, I had no idea how many parks the city has. I mean, it is hundreds, and they're just like in so many nooks and crannies, and they're beautiful. You know, I mean, it's just such a, I mean, ITP.
Yes.
You got one of the best ones near, you know, Southwest Atlanta, and like that. There's like a Central Park right there.
Yes. Well, it's and each of those, the city's been green for a long time.
Yeah.
And a lot of that land was privately held. Maynard and ultimately Andy and Bill Campbell all invested in green space and parks. Yeah. And then along comes Cathy Woolard, who is the president of council when I was in office. And she offered the idea, having heard from Ryan Gravel about the Beltline. And frankly, it originally didn't have parks. It had trails. And a renowned landscape architect.
Yeah. I want to get to the Beltline. I want to get to a lot of the cleaning of Atlanta, particularly the sewer piece, because I know that was, I mean, when you took over, I think we were getting fined by EPA on just our system. When you did come in, and this is when you took over office, you inherited a deficit, and I think it's a good time to ask the question, particularly a lot of the pandemic-induced deficits that are likely going to happen. Is the simple equation of figuring out and fixing a deficit is it slash costs, raise taxes? I mean, what you did it, right? You had to come in and you had this deficit and get creative with accounting. What is the secret to balancing a budget from a municipal perspective?
Well, I'd had the advantage of working with Andy and Maynard. So I had been a part of the city's budget process when I was elected, and I actually didn't have a runoff. So I was elected in November, which meant that I had 2 full months after my election to get started. Unfortunately, the mayors before me and after me have all had runoffs, so they really couldn't get started with city policy until sometime in December, just before they were inaugurated. But I had 2 months, two full months, and I convened a group. And Peter Amon was a partner at Bain Consulting, and he volunteered to help me on a project. He'd read about what I was discussing. At the time, we didn't know what the city's finances were. And I thought, okay, if you're going to help me on something hard. So I said, figure out the budget. Well, that was probably one of my best decisions ever. Nobody ever asked about it. Because now I have a management consultant who does this for a living, who came pro bono and put together a team to analyze the budget, compared Atlanta's budget to 18 other budgets for cities around the country, and was able to look at the cost benefit, the distribution of funds, the flow of funds, the cash flow, and all of that, and gave us that analysis. So now we're no longer at we're really at first base. By the time we get into office, it is through that process that we discovered that we would have, and Maynard corrected me. We didn't have a deficit, although it's often described that way. We had a shortfall in our projections.
Right.
In other words, if we followed the budget that was left, we would have a shortfall at the end of the year. So Peter and his team, David Edwards and some others, they helped us to identify where we could cut costs.
Right.
And I just had this conversation the other day with someone. I mean, one of the ways to do that is to start with, what are you required to do under the federal law? What are you required to do under state law or agreements? And what are you required to do under the city code? And then everything else is up for grabs.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean, I'm going to give you a really bad example because we've talked about green space. So let's say you have great erosion problems in your parks. That's not required by federal law. It's not or agreement, state or city code. So unfortunately, the first year, pay raises, certain positions, they are not necessarily required by any of these lenses that you've used, not any of the lens that you've used to make your adjustment. And one of the biggest ones was we discovered that the city of Atlanta, on arrest, these are really grungy topics. I don't know if this is what you want to know.
Yeah, this is very, very detailed, and this is perfect.
Well, so I remember we took a break, and I had just seen a presentation on the city's jail and the cost of the city's jail. So I came back into the room afterwards and said, who is at the city jail that we are required by state or federal law to have? And found out that we were holding people for days and sometimes weeks that really belonged in the county facility.
So that's expensive.
That's expensive. And they had no incentive to pick them up because they're saving money and they had shortage of space. Well, as the mayor of Atlanta, that really wasn't my problem.
Yep.
So I called the county and said, beginning at such and such a date, everyone that is arrested on a state offense is coming directly to the county facilities. And that saved millions of dollars every year.
Right.
Same with the courts. We had 2 courts, a municipal court and a traffic court. After a 18-month review of its operations on very minute in detail, we discovered that we could handle all of those folks, everyone, through one court system and save over $10 million a year today.
You talk about calling the county, and before we press play, I know you mentioned you were in the state capitol recently. How vital is that relationship for the mayor to have with the state, the county, knowing that the county expands, outside the city limits? How did you view that as a mayor for the relationship in terms of importance?
Well, I viewed the relationship between the county and the city, the state and the city, the business community and the city, the neighborhoods, all of those are important. And I learned that from Andrew Young and Maynard Jackson. Maynard and Andy both had very strong points of reference and relationship with state leaders, whether it was Tom Murphy, who was the Speaker of the House, or the sitting governor.
And to build those relationships, what are people doing? I mean, are they grabbing lunches? Are they, going on walks? Are they just setting a time? Or is it a regular weekly or, monthly? Is it less fluid? What does building relationships mean?
Well, it depends. In the case of the county, I had a strong relationship that was regular communication with Commissioner Nancy Boxall, who was one of the longest serving members of the county commission and the first woman on the commission. And she was a personal friend, but more than that, she was someone who represented the city at the county because of her jurisdiction. So I had a close relationship. But the key to any relationship is honesty and transparency. I mean, being willing to have it go both ways, to recognize you're not always going to agree. And I served while Roy Barnes was governor, but I also served while Sonny Perdue was governor. And I sought Sonny Perdue out. I mean, our politics was very different. I went to him within weeks of his election, asked for a meeting, sat down. The two of us talked, and I remember telling him that I had 2 or 3 things that mattered to me, and I wouldn't worry him about anything else. I tried not to make our differences personal or angry, and we agreed that if we had something to say to each other, we would call each other directly, so that we were not speaking either through the media or social media on issues, that we would have direct communication. And we did that throughout the balance of my term. That makes a huge difference. And I don't think those principles are any different today than they were 15 years ago or 18 years ago now.
Yep. One of your many legacies as mayor is the sewer system and the cleaning of the sewers. I mean, when you took over, we were getting fined by the EPA. How did you build a coalition to make that a top priority? Like what were the steps to say, this is a priority, we have to do it, and I'm getting everyone on the train?
So let me be really clear. The first priority was to convince the public that I would be open and honest. So we passed ethics legislation within the first months, very tough ethics legislation, and I was very public about it. The second thing really almost simultaneously, was to balance the budget and to be honest about the budget with everyone, including those people who were hurt by the cuts that we put in place. And all of that happened within 2 to 3 months. So then the question was, what else is pressing? And remember I said, what was required by the federal government? Well, the federal government, I had a visit from EPA administrator who was located in Atlanta and the head of EPD for the state of Georgia. And they looked me in the eye and said, "You're in trouble." This was in February of 2002.
I mean, you're still.
I've just been there a month.
You just put
right?
the welcome mat out.
Right. And if you don't fix this, your fines from last year were $80 million.
Yeah, that will create some urgency.
That creates urgency. And I said, okay. I then enlisted their advice on what steps that we should take to gain their trust. And we added to that, created the Department of Watershed Management, consolidated the water and sewer issues, unfortunately had to raise water rates, also went to the state. That was one of the items that I asked Sonny Perdue, who was the governor, for help on, which was a 1-cent sales tax. All of that was done as a result of that issue. And probably, I don't know that everyone would think that my involvement was that important, but I worked on it every single day for 18 months. Yeah. Not some days. I didn't have a press conference and then turn it over to other folks. I literally worked on some aspect of the water sewer issues for 18 months. And some of my supporters, people who'd been with me for all through the campaign, would say to me, "Aren't you tired of talking about water and sewer?" And they didn't. I mean, I had to create a sense of urgency and a movement. And I also dubbed myself the sewer mayor. Yeah. Because you've got to make this real for folks. I knew it was real when I went into a grocery store, a small neighborhood grocery store, to buy some candy. And I was by myself one afternoon on the weekend, and the clerk stopped the line that was forming behind me to ask me the impact, so she could understand the impact of the sales tax on her water bill. She said, "Aren't you the mayor?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, tell me," and she had a series of questions about why voting for a 1-cent sales tax was either in her interest or not. And I went back to the office the next week and I said, "We got this vote." Yeah. And it's actually passed every time since then because people fundamentally understood it. Howard Dean was running for president, and he came to Atlanta and he was at a ritzy hotel, 150 people there. And after he made his presentation, he told me that somebody from the back said, "Well, what are you going to do about water and sewer? What are you going to do about the sewer system and infrastructure?"
And he's like, "What?"
So he met me afterwards and he said, "No place in America has anyone ever asked me about the sewer system and the federal government's support."
So the campaign was working. You talked about the ethics committee. Have Americans lost trust in institutions today? And if so, how would you instill trust in institutions? I mean, the ethics committee that you enacted seemed like it worked.
Well, it works as well as it works, and you have to be ever vigilant. The keys are, you say what you're going to do, and that ought to be based on research and reality, not what you wish you could do, on what really is possible. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a stretch goal, but
yep.
You say what you're going to do, you then do it.
Pretty simple.
Then you do it, and you take the hits if it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Or you take the praise if it does. And then you retool, do the research, say what you're going to do. I mean, I felt the most important element of my terms of office, the hardest thing for me to do was to gain and maintain public trust. Everything else was easy. Everything else was easy. It was from someone stopping me on the street and having a question and me brushing them off versus listening and then following up. Being honest. I was asked to do many things by people who were in important positions and just everyday folks that I couldn't do.
Yep.
But I had to say, I can't do that. Or I won't do it because I don't agree with you. That's how you build trust. Now, I don't know how I would operate in the Twitter world, but I think you have to call it straight.
Mm-hmm.
I had people very upset with me. I mean, there were people after I left office who said, well, you need to run again. I'm like, you forget how hard you were on me when I was there, right? And it just takes a lot of, you just have to stay true to those values. And one of the best compliments I've ever gotten, I got again in a grocery store from a man who was, about my age. And he looked me in the eye. He said, I didn't like everything you did, but you told the truth and you shot us straight. So that's my advice to anyone. Sure. Don't try to spin, if this notion that you can spin, what can you spin in with Google and
all the data and
all
info
the
out
data
there.
and the information out there? You can't spin anything.
And we're going to take a quick break here and share that this podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business out of Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com. So you started on the trail of the Beltline, and there's a lot to talk about around the Beltline, particularly. Did you have any idea that in 2021 the Beltline would be the phenomenal success that it is today? Back in 2005?
Oh yeah, we knew then.
Yep.
I mean, the team that was working on it, and I knew that the Beltline would be transformative to the city. I actually said that then, and I believed it because the city had not in a long, long time, I mean decades, done a plan that was as comprehensive around kind of those issues, connectivity of neighborhoods.
And so Ryan Gravel connects with Cathy Woolard.
Cathy Woolard meets with me. Cathy and I met every week for an hour, one-on-one, for 2 years.
About the Beltline?
No, about everything.
Okay, yep.
And at the end of every meeting, she'd say, you got to look at this Beltline. You got to look at this Beltline. And I would dismiss it because I was working on budget and sewers and other things. And I'm like, Cathy, I don't have room on my plate. And finally, she decided to run for Congress. So she was leaving the council, and she came to our normal meeting and said, you got to take this. I took a deep breath. I called our economic development team, headed by Greg Gianelli and Tina Arbus and some others, and said, we got to take a look at this. And they looked at it and looked at it and looked at it and studied it. And periodically, a month would go by, 2 months would go by, and they'd say, there's no way this is going to work.
Yep.
And I encouraged them. I was the cheerleader, and they finally came back with a plan. And that was the plan that was adopted by the council. And not unanimously, I might mention.
Right.
But that's okay. You just need a majority to win. So, that's fine with me. Unanimous votes are very expensive votes politically.
The grand vision is, connecting it all, but did you just have to sell one part to start?
No, we sold the whole thing.
Sold the whole thing.
We sold the whole thing. Yeah, the original plan was 25 years, through over $3 billion of investment. Spent hours and hours and hours really and really days and months really investigating whether it was possible. People started to read about it in other parts of the country.
Yep.
And started to call us, people who are in the business of rebuilding cities. And one was an architect who was teaching at Yale. And I met him because there was another little side project we did. When you're mayor, a lot of people want to use breakfast or lunch with you as a fundraiser for their not-for-profit. So someone bought breakfast or lunch with me. And this guy flew down from Connecticut or New York. He designed Bryant Park in New York. And he puts up on the screen that the Beltline is fine. It's trails at that point. But we've missed something. We missed parks. And he had his students actually develop the initial plan for adding parks, including Quarry Park, to the Beltline. And we're like, wow. Never thought of that.
Yeah.
No.
Great idea.
Great idea. So where does that come from? Open door, open mind, intellectual curiosity, humility. We don't have all the answers. Obviously, there are other answers out there.
What was the political risk to say yes to the Beltline versus no? I mean,
well, we negotiated. I mean, there was a community advisory committee that the council wanted. We added that. We had some concern about affordability, so we added affordable housing to the bond issues. I mean, the risk is always that you fail and that it's not successful. I mean, it's successful on a lot of levels. But on the other hand, the affordability issue, the housing affordability issue has not been fully realized. And that's a problem.
Yes. So that touches on another point I wanted to ask about is what does responsible population growth look like in Atlanta? And of course, the gentrification word, right? How do you think about that today, knowing that things like the Beltline have really put momentum behind the gentrification and economic advancement, but also knowing that there's neighborhoods being, that are moving and evolving, and what's your thought on that?
I got lots of thoughts about that.
I would like to hear them.
But let's start with this. I believed in 2005 because I had learned in 2000 with the census that the population was shifting in Atlanta already. So the population shift after the Olympics in 1996, for the first time, Atlanta was beginning to grow in population and become a center, a metropolitan center that was attractive to younger people.
Right.
So we knew that in 2002. You really learned about the census by one in 2002. So by 2005, you see this trend. Now, you don't know how fast it's going to be because you really don't know how strong the economy is going to be. But Georgia Tech is expanding. The AU Center schools are expanding. People are moving in. New industries are coming.
This is a decade before Ponce City Market. I mean, exactly. It was still east. It was still City Hall East.
Exactly. So things are changing. So the question is, what can you do to ensure? The question for me with the Beltline was, what can you do to ensure planned development in the city long term? And the issue of 50-year horizon planning was something that I adopted early in my term. Mayor of Denver, Wellington Webb, said to me, mayors need to spend their time thinking about what their city is going to be like 50 years from now. You get drawn into what's going to happen this weekend or next year, but don't allow yourself to do that, Shirley. So I listened to him, and I insisted that we not think about city planning in reference to the budget cycle, the federal budget cycle, or program cycle, but rather we think about what kind of city do we want to have in 50 years. Because I want people to look back at the 2000s, my term and others, and say they made some good decisions.
Yeah.
50 years from now. The Beltline fits into that horizon because you're building infrastructure. We put the money in the infrastructure that would support the city long term. Parks, trails, right-of-way, maybe transit someday. And I think we fell short on our commitment to affordable housing because we didn't ensure that it would happen. We put it in the budget plan, but for whatever reason, it hadn't been fully implemented. And I don't have the answers for why that is. But so Atlanta was going to grow anyway. The question is, was the city going to have any input on how it grew?
Right.
And where it grew? Because the growth up until then was largely north of the city, not south. So the first Beltline trail is in West End. The second one is on the east side. And then you see the connection. I actually walk on the Beltline. And I ran into Cathy Woolard one Sunday, too. There are like 10 of us out there. And she was one of the people, right? But the bottom line is that was the whole principle.
Right.
What will make a difference to the city 50 years from now? And we knew then that the investment of infrastructure, just as the investment of infrastructure and water infrastructure, fuels the economy and the public health and maintains the public health of the city, just as the investment in airport has made a difference in the economy. We knew then that the Beltline would be a long-term project. After my term, there was a lot of debate among politicians, including Mayor Reed and others, as to whether the Beltline, I don't know what the debate was because I didn't really pay a lot of attention, but whether there should be an investment in the Beltline. Well, I knew, and the team that we worked with knew
that it was already happening.
That question was off the table.
Yep.
We just let people talk about it because we knew that the financial structure was such that it would be able to sustain itself. Maybe not as originally planned, but sustained itself
and
over 20 years.
The trend of people moving into the city.
And investing in the city. So maybe 5 years ago, I heard a council debate about whether the city ought to invest in the Beltline. And I actually called Felicia Moore, who was a councilwoman at the time. And I said, well, I want you to give me an example of where you can put $300 million and get a direct investment of $1.5 billion, according to the city's numbers, in 10 years. Just any place. I said the conversation ought to be, how do you invest more in it, not less? But you see, unless you look at it as a long-term play, if you just look at it as an annual budget play, there are probably a lot of reasons why you wouldn't invest. But if you look at it as a long-term play for the city, there's just really no argument. Now, what you invest in, whether it's the transit piece or whether it's affordable housing first, we've got the infrastructure for the parks. They've done that. So there you have it.
I mean, and one of the reasons so many people are asked the question, how do we not turn into San Francisco? How do we not turn into, a continually socioeconomic divided tale of two cities? And I feel like the leaders of Atlanta have been cognizant and have thought about, how to build the beloved city, right? And as the ball is now rolling in terms of economic growth, how do we stay on track where there is affordable housing, where there is there is diversity in income on the Beltline, in the city.
We need to do something about wages in Georgia. Yep. Wages are low. And we need to do, obviously an investment in education. There is no reason why Atlanta does not have excellent schools in every single neighborhood. There is no reason why a city or a county or a state does not invest in affordable housing. There are plenty of examples now. At purpose-built communities where I've worked for 10 years, whether you go to historic South Atlanta with FCS, or whether you go to Grove Park, or certainly at Eastlake, we've proven that you can build communities with mixed income. And there are other communities like Centennial Park where Integral and Egbert Perry did work. So there really needs to be an investment in neighborhoods so that people can both live there, afford to live there, want to live there, but also that are healthy neighborhoods that have access to not just parks, but also groceries and fresh produce and great education.
Can you talk about the purpose-built communities for the listeners? What was the thesis, right, from day one? And you've spent 10 years there. There's a lot of success stories, and I feel like that we could do a whole podcast just on that, right? In terms of the learnings, the hypothesis, the validation. Can you just give the readers a high-level purpose-built community, and then, over the last 10 years, maybe one or two of the biggest lessons learned of, yes, you can do what we set out to achieve?
That's a great story. It's not my story, but I'll tell you that three people, Tom Cousins, who was a developer and a philanthropist, Renee Glover, who was the head of the Atlanta Housing Authority, and Eva Davis, who was the leader of the Association of Residents in Eastlake, came together, prompted by Renee and Tom, but also Ms. Davis. And they negotiated a model that is mixed income rental housing to replace rundown, vacant, underinvested housing, a great school model, K to 12, pre-K, actually early childhood to 12, and then post high school graduation education, and something we call community wellness, which is everything from training in education, healthcare access, safety in the streets, sidewalks, etc. They negotiated that model 25 years ago, and the result is the Villages of Eastlake, which has all of those components and have been modeled and remodeled, kind of tweaked over the years. People saw that, went to Tom or Renee or Ms. Davis, and were interested around the country. So today, that model is being, it's the wrong word to say replicated, but used to do developments in Omaha and Columbus, Ohio, and in Birmingham, Alabama. It's a neighborhood-centric, neighborhood-based model. It's not a citywide model. And it is intended to support the people who are at the lowest income, but to include in that model middle-income people. Right. So there is this notion that we've replaced low-income people. No, more low-income families send their children to Drew Charter School than almost any, in absolute numbers, than any other school in the system. But they all are achieving at a high level because in that case, we went to a charter. In some other cities, we're actually a more traditional school or a contract school. And there's lots of opportunity to talk about the advantages to that. So, but the notion is one of the key ways to break these generational conditions that have people living in poverty is to provide a safe place, an affordable place, a community network, and community resources right there in the neighborhood, great education, and access to opportunities both in your neighborhood, but as a result of the relationships that you build in those situations. So Atlanta now has 3, Grove Park, FCS, and Eastlake, and then there are more than 25 around the country. So that is a growing model, and you really should, but it's not the only one.
Right.
You have Centennial Place, which is another model, and the Centennial School Academy there. I mean, you also have now purpose-built schools that is taking the school model and operating from the school out as opposed to from the community organization out.
It seems like such a common sense way to solve the problem. I mean, are there any blind spots, any areas of opportunity that you would, if you had waved a magic wand, you're like, here's one thing we'd add to it?
Well, one of the things that has been added that was a blind spot was health. There is a lot of research that shows that where you live, the zip code, where you're born, determines your health outcomes for the rest of your life. And you can look at, there's lots of studies about that. So we had not really taken we were involved in improving health, but didn't know it. Yep. So now working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who is a large health-focused foundation, they are helping us to understand that. So that's one key element. What's the difference between having a walking neighborhood? You're a healthier neighborhood. Catherine Ross did a study funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 2005 or 2006 on the Beltline that showed Atlantans would be healthier as a result of the Beltline, the trails and the walking and the riding. So we didn't think about that. Sure. That would be one. The second is the question that we're really clear that it needs to be a locally based neighborhood. There is a question as to whether you could do more faster if you formed a central organization that worked in multiple neighborhoods. We don't know the answer to that. Right. There's a theory that you could. And there's some folks like Egbert Perry, Carol Naughton, and Dave Edwards, all of whom would love to talk to you.
Yeah.
Any one of them to talk to you about the model.
That sounds like a good follow-up. A couple more questions. I know we're coming on time. If you were leading today, how would you galvanize the community to unite around a common goal, right? I mean, we talked about it. Social media, people get in their echo chambers and their silos. How would you unite a set of goals, or unite around a set of goals, so Atlantans emerge from this pandemic stronger?
Well, first of all, I don't know.
Yep.
So I don't think about that very often. But the principles that I would use is I'd listen a lot. There's a mayor in Dayton, Ohio. As soon as she was elected, she did a listening tour, and it was issues-based. So she did one on early childhood and one on criminal justice and one on housing, and she invited people to come. That's part of a listening process and data and research. I do a lot of research, and I would ask people to provide a lot of data and information about where are we really? Yep. Not where do we say we are, not where do
we are.
We are, or people think we are. Where are we really? Then tell folks what I learned. And then say, I got some suggestions as to where we start.
I love it.
During my term, I gained momentum, and my administration gained momentum when we were able to fix the budget, when we were able to balance the budget. People looked at me differently because they were like, oh, she's not going to be able to do that. She doesn't have the nerve to do it, some of the things, right? I proposed a 42% tax increase in the first 6 weeks I was in office and laid off 1,000 people. Yeah. in the first 6 weeks and took a $40,000 pay cut. That got people, all of that got people's attention. And my dad used to say, the key to leadership is you've got to get people's attention. You can have the right idea all day and all night,
right.
But if people are not listening and they don't trust you, there is no way that they're going to follow you. So I would do a lot of research. I think some of that research has been done, but I think it gets squashed, it gets put to the side, and there's not enough discussion about it. And people are acting on their intuition, opinions, or emotions, all of which are valid. Yep. But it's not the only basis on which you need to make big public policy decisions.
Well, Shirley, I can't thank you enough for your time today. We always follow up with the last question, why Atlanta and what Atlanta has done for you?
Atlanta's been a great city for me. It's been good for my family. I love the people. I love the history. And I also love the weather.
Yeah.
And I think most of all that Atlanta is a city of possibilities. Atlanta believes in itself. And I don't mean just the city of Atlanta. I mean the metropolitan area. We take on challenges. We seize opportunities. And we have a history of that going back 150, 60 years. And it's good to be in a place that looks forward, not always backwards.
Well, I truly, as the 58th mayor of the city of Atlanta, I really appreciate you being part of the Atlanta Story podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. It was co-produced by J.C. Lucas and Jon Birdsong. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business in Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com and the companies we work with who've done it before. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it at your next coffee meeting or dinner greeting, rate it, and write a benevolent, eloquent review.